I landed in Miami without warning and found my daughter unconscious in the trauma ward with a shattered spine. Her husband claimed he had gone away to pray for her recovery. 20 minutes later, I heard champagne glasses clinking and a woman laughing through his phone. That was the exact moment I decided someone was about to lose everything. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 years I made my living on Wall Street by dismantling companies that believed they were untouchable. I retired 5 years ago after selling my investment firm for more money than anyone could reasonably spend in a lifetime. I thought I had buried the ruthless man I used to be. I was wrong. The predator had only been sleeping, and the moment I saw my only daughter lying motionless in that hospital bed, he woke up. Jackson Memorial Hospital smelled like antiseptic, exhaustion, and fear. My security team had already texted me Rachel's room number before my plane touched the runway, so I walked straight past the reception desk without speaking to anyone. Every second felt stolen from my daughter. When I pushed open the door to room 714, I stopped breathing. Rachel barely looked like herself. Purple bruises covered one side of her face. A thick brace surrounded her neck. Tubes disappeared beneath blankets that hid the rest of her injuries, while machines breathed for her with slow, mechanical precision. 15 years earlier, after my wife Catherine died from ovarian cancer, Rachel had become the only family I had left. I had watched her graduate, build a career, and fall in love with the man she insisted would never hurt her. Standing beside that hospital bed, I realized how completely wrong both of us had been. What hurt even more than the injuries was the silence surrounding her. The visitor's chair beside the bed was perfectly straight, untouched for hours. There were no flowers, no overnight bag, no coffee cup. Nothing suggested a husband had spent even a single hour waiting beside his wife while surgeons fought to keep her alive. A nurse quietly entered carrying medication. She paused when she saw me standing there with one hand resting on Rachel's blanket. "Are you family?" she asked softly. "I'm her father," I answered. "Where's Connor?" The nurse hesitated for just a moment. After 4 decades of negotiating billion-dollar deals, I had learned that hesitation almost always hides an ugly truth. She looked toward the empty chair before speaking. "Mr. Davenport left several hours ago. He said watching her suffer was too much emotionally. He told us he needed time alone at a meditation retreat to pray for her recovery." A meditation retreat. I looked back at Rachel. 3 years earlier, I had handed Connor the keys to a $2 million penthouse as a wedding gift because I believed financial security would help protect my daughter. Instead, I had apparently financed the lifestyle of a man who couldn't even sit beside his unconscious wife. I thanked the nurse and stepped into the hallway before pulling out my phone. Connor answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad," he said, sounding exhausted. "I'm so glad you called. I couldn't stay at the hospital." Seeing Rachel like that was destroying me. His performance would have fooled almost anyone. Almost. "Where are you?" I asked calmly. "At a wellness retreat in the Everglades," he replied without hesitation. "I'm doing meditation and energy healing. I needed to clear my head so I can be strong when Rachel wakes up." Then I heard it. First came the deep pulse of dance music. A second later, I heard water splashing, followed by a young woman laughing loudly enough to drown out whatever lie Connor was about to invent next. It wasn't the sound of prayer. It wasn't silence. It sounded exactly like a luxury resort. "Is everything all right there?" I asked, pretending to believe him. "Very peaceful," he replied. "I've been praying nonstop." I looked through the hospital window at my daughter lying completely alone. "Good," I said quietly. "Stay exactly where you are. I'll take care of everything here." Before he could answer, I ended the call. My security chief, Garrison, had been waiting outside the ICU. A former FBI agent, he had spent 15 years protecting my family and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. I handed him my phone. "Track him," I said. Garrison nodded once and walked away without another word. I returned to Rachel's bedside, gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, and leaned close enough that only she could have heard me if she had been awake. "I couldn't protect your mother," I whispered, "but I swear to you, sweetheart, whoever abandoned you tonight is about to learn exactly what happens when someone comes after my family. At that exact moment, Garrison hurried back into the hallway, holding a tablet. One glance at his face told me everything. Connor Davenport wasn't anywhere near the Everglades. He was more than 150 miles away, relaxing at a 5-star resort in Key West. Garrison needed less than 4 minutes to confirm what my instincts had already accepted as fact. Connor Davenport wasn't meditating anywhere near the Everglades. His phone was connected to the private wireless network of the Ocean Crest Resort, one of the most exclusive luxury properties in Key West. The security footage attached to the resort's guest registry showed him checking in the previous evening, less than 3 hours after surgeons rushed Rachel into emergency surgery. He wasn't alone. A woman wearing oversized sunglasses walked beside him with one hand wrapped around his arm, while hotel staff loaded expensive luggage onto a golf cart waiting outside the lobby. Garrison enlarged the image before quietly handing me the tablet. "We've identified her," he said. "Emily Cross, 29 years old, lifestyle influencer, no visible employment history. Her social media accounts show she's been traveling almost non-stop for the past year." I stared at Connor's smiling face, frozen on the screen. 12 hours earlier, my daughter had been trapped inside a crushed Mercedes, while firefighters cut through twisted steel to reach her. At almost the exact same time, her husband had been checking into a beachfront resort with another woman. Before I could respond, the ICU doors burst open. A trauma surgeon stepped into the hallway, still wearing surgical scrubs. "Mr. Holloway," he called urgently. I walked toward him immediately. "We've stabilized your daughter's internal bleeding," he said, "but her spinal injuries are far more serious than we initially believed. A second procedure needs to begin within the next hour if we want to maximize her chances of walking again." "Then do it." The surgeon hesitated. "There's one complication. Because Rachel is legally married, we first attempted to reach her husband for surgical authorization. We called 6 times. Every call went to voicemail." He paused before adding the sentence no father should ever hear. "Without immediate consent, we're losing valuable time." I didn't hesitate for a single second. "What do you need from me?" 10 minutes later, I signed every authorization required under Florida emergency medical law after hospital counsel confirmed I could act as Rachel's next available decision-maker because her spouse remained unreachable during a life-threatening emergency. The surgeon thanked me before rushing back toward the operating suite. As the doors closed behind him, I looked at Garrison. "Call Connor again." This time he answered with obvious irritation. Loud music echoed behind him. Someone cheered in the background. "What now?" he asked. "The hospital needed your authorization for Rachel's surgery," I replied calmly. There was a brief silence before he answered. "I didn't hear my phone." Another woman's voice laughed nearby. Connor quickly covered the microphone, but not before I heard someone ask whether the champagne had arrived. He returned a moment later. "Is everything handled?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "The hospital found someone willing to show up for my daughter." He exhaled with what sounded disturbingly like relief. "Good. Tell the doctors to do whatever they think is best. I'll come back when things settle down." I ended the call without another word. There was nothing left to say. Connor had just measured his wife's life against the inconvenience of interrupting his vacation, and the vacation had won. Garrison broke the silence. "Do you want me to bring him here?" 5 years earlier, I might have answered yes. Today, I shook my head. No. If he comes now, he'll only start inventing excuses. I looked once more through the ICU window where nurses were preparing Rachel for another operation. "I don't want excuses." Garrison understood immediately. "You want evidence." I nodded. "Every phone record, every bank transaction, every insurance policy, every debt, every affair, every lie he's ever told my daughter." Garrison made a single call before slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Done," he said. "My team is already moving." I watched the operating room doors close as Rachel disappeared inside for the second time that day. My daughter was fighting to save her future. Connor was drinking champagne by the ocean. The balance between those two realities would not exist much longer. An hour later, Garrison returned, carrying another folder. "You'll want to see this before we leave." Inside were the first financial reports pulled from Connor's accounts. Several unusually large transactions had occurred during the 6 weeks before Rachel's crash. The money trail didn't make sense yet, but one thing already did. Connor hadn't simply abandoned his wife. He had been preparing for something long before the accident happened. I closed the folder, stood up, and picked up my coat. "Book the Gulf Stream," I said quietly. Garrison looked at me. "Key West?" I nodded once. "If Connor wants a vacation?" I looked back at Rachel one final time before walking toward the elevator. "I'll make sure it's the last peaceful day he ever has." The Gulf Stream lifted off less than 40 minutes later, climbing above the lights of Miami while Rachel fought for her future inside an operating room hundreds of feet below. I had made enough difficult decisions in my life to recognize when emotions became a liability. Anger could wait. Facts couldn't. Before we reached cruising altitude, Victoria Chen appeared on the large screen inside the aircraft's conference cabin. She had served as my personal attorney for nearly 20 years and possessed a rare gift for finding the truth hidden beneath paperwork most people never bothered to read. "I've started digging into Connor's finances," she said without wasting a second. "The deeper I go, the worse it gets." I folded my hands on the table. "Start with the biggest problem." Victoria opened the first report. 8 months ago, Connor refinanced the Brickell penthouse you bought them as a wedding gift. He borrowed $1.8 million against the property. I frowned immediately. "That's impossible. Rachel would have needed to approve that loan." Victoria looked directly into the camera. She didn't. Another document appeared on the screen. Rachel's signature sat neatly at the bottom of the mortgage agreement. Even before Victoria spoke, I knew something was wrong. I'd watched my daughter sign documents since she was 16 years old. The shape of the letters looked similar, but the rhythm was different. "Forgery?" I asked quietly. Victoria nodded. "Our handwriting expert is already reviewing it, but I'm 99% certain the signature wasn't written by Rachel." I leaned back in my seat as another piece of the puzzle slid into place. Connor hadn't simply lied to my daughter. He had stolen from her. Victoria continued. "The money didn't go toward a business expansion like he claimed. Within 4 months, he transferred nearly every dollar through offshore accounts before losing it in cryptocurrency speculation, online sports betting, and unsecured private gambling debts." Garrison quietly placed another folder beside me. "We confirmed that part independently," he said. "Connor owes money all over Florida." I slowly turned another page. Every failed investment, every unpaid credit line, every overdue notice. Connor wasn't living like a successful entrepreneur. He was surviving on borrowed time while pretending to be wealthy. "How close was he to financial collapse?" I asked. Victoria didn't hesitate. 30 days, maybe less. The lender had already started preparing foreclosure paperwork on the penthouse. Silence filled the cabin. Suddenly, his expensive dinners, luxury vacations, designer watches, and constant need to impress everyone around him made perfect sense. None of it had ever belonged to him. It had all been purchased with money he couldn't repay. Garrison spoke next. Our investigators also reviewed the preliminary accident report. He slid photographs of Rachel's destroyed Mercedes across the table. The front end had been crushed almost beyond recognition. "Police ruled it driver error for now," he said, "but something about the report feels rushed." I studied the photographs without speaking. Rachel had driven cautiously her entire life. She never sped. She rarely even used cruise control. The idea that she had suddenly lost control on a clear stretch of interstate didn't fit the daughter I knew. "Recover the vehicle," I said. "I don't care if it's sitting in a salvage yard. I want our own forensic engineers examining every piece of it." Garrison nodded. "Already arranged." Victoria interrupted before I could ask another question. "Marcus, there's something else." Her tone had changed. It was quieter now, more careful. She pulled up a digital insurance policy dated just 6 weeks before Rachel's accident. Connor purchased a new term life insurance policy naming himself as the sole beneficiary. I felt my jaw tighten. "How much?" $5 million. She paused for only a second before adding the sentence that made the temperature inside the cabin seem to drop. "The policy includes a double indemnity clause. If Rachel dies in an accident, the payout increases to $10 million. No one spoke. Even Garrison remained silent. I stared at the policy number displayed on the screen while every conversation I'd had with Connor over the past 3 years replayed inside my head. His complaints about money, his constant pressure to invest more, his frustration whenever Rachel refused to sell assets I had given her. Until that moment, I had believed I was chasing a selfish husband who abandoned his wife. Now another possibility stood in front of me, one so dark I didn't want to believe it myself. I looked at Victoria. "Don't tell me what you think." She nodded slowly. "I won't. Tell me only what you can prove." She took a deep breath. "Today I can prove Connor forged financial documents. I can prove he's drowning in debt. I can prove he secretly purchased a $10 million accidental death policy on your daughter just weeks before her crash." She closed the file. "Everything else still requires evidence." I stood and walked toward the aircraft window. Far below, the lights of the Florida Keys shimmered across the black water like scattered stars. Somewhere ahead, Connor Davenport was probably raising another glass, convinced his biggest problem was an angry father-in-law. He had no idea that, with every mile this jet carried me closer to Key West, the questions surrounding Rachel's accident were becoming more dangerous than any answer he could possibly invent. The closer our jet came to Key West, the calmer I became. People often mistake calm for mercy. After 40 years on Wall Street, I knew it usually meant the opposite. Every hostile takeover I had ever won began the same way, not with shouting, but with preparation. Connor still believed he was free. What he didn't understand was that freedom disappears long before a person realizes the cage has already closed around them. Victoria called again just before we began our descent. "Everything is finished," she said. "I need details," I replied. "Every major lender accepted our offers. Through separate holding companies, we've acquired the mortgage on the Brickell penthouse, the outstanding balance on his Range Rover, every unsecured credit line, and every gambling debt we were able to locate. As of 23 minutes ago, Connor Davenport no longer owes money to 5 different institutions." She paused briefly. "He owes all of it to you." I looked out the aircraft window at the scattered lights of the islands below. "How much?" "Just under $6 million, including penalties, accumulated interest, and accelerated repayment clauses." Garrison smiled faintly across the cabin. "Financially speaking," he said, "he's already dead." I shook my head. "Not yet. Dead men don't learn lessons." Victoria understood exactly what I meant. "Every agreement includes acceleration provisions. Whenever you're ready, we can legally demand immediate repayment. If he fails, foreclosure begins automatically." "Good," I answered. "But not tonight. First, I want him to believe tomorrow will be just another perfect day." The Gulfstream touched down at Key West International shortly after midnight. A black SUV waited on the private tarmac with 2 members of my advanced security team already inside. As soon as I climbed into the vehicle, Garrison handed me another tablet, connected to a live surveillance feed. "Connor hasn't left the resort once," he reported. "He's been drinking since dinner." The screen showed a beautifully illuminated infinity pool overlooking the ocean. Expensive music drifted through outdoor speakers while waiters carried champagne beneath swaying palm trees. Connor was sitting on the edge of the pool, with one arm wrapped around a young blonde woman wearing a white designer dress. They looked carefree, happy, completely untouched by the nightmare unfolding in Miami. I watched without saying a word. The SUV continued rolling through the quiet streets toward the waterfront. "Zoom in," I finally said. Garrison enlarged the image until the woman's upper body filled the screen. At first I noticed only the champagne glass in her hand. Then my eyes stopped moving. Hanging around her neck was a platinum necklace with deep blue sapphires surrounding a single, flawless diamond. Every breath caught inside my chest. I knew that necklace better than I knew my own reflection. I had commissioned it 27 years earlier for Catherine on our 20th wedding anniversary. She wore it to every important family celebration until cancer stole her from us. On the morning Rachel married Connor, I had fastened that same necklace around my daughter's neck while telling her, "Whenever you wear this, your mother walks beside you." Rachel had cried as she hugged me. She promised she would never take it off unless she passed it to her own daughter one day. Now it rested against the skin of another woman, As if my family's memories were nothing more than another expensive accessory Connor had decided to give away. "When was this footage taken?" I asked quietly. "7 minutes ago," Garrison replied. "Our team confirms she's been wearing it all evening. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Money could always be earned again. Companies could be rebuilt. Even reputations sometimes recovered. But stealing something that carried Catherine's memory, something Rachel treasured more than any luxury I had ever bought her, crossed into a place where forgiveness no longer existed." Garrison carefully studied my face. He had seen me negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without raising my voice. He had watched me remain calm during lawsuits that threatened entire corporations. He had never seen me look like this. "Marcus," he said cautiously. I never took my eyes off the screen. "Call Victoria." Less than a minute later, her voice came through the speaker. "I'm here. Move to phase 2. She was silent for a heartbeat. "The nuclear option?" "Yes. Once we start," she warned, "there's no reversing it." I continued staring at Connor laughing beside the pool, while another man refilled his champagne glass. "He took the last thing my wife ever gave our daughter," I said quietly. Whatever mercy I had left ended the moment he did that. Victoria answered with the same cold certainty that had won us countless legal battles. "Understood." She disconnected without another word. As we entered the resort's private entrance a few minutes later, my phone vibrated one more time. It was the surgeon in Miami. "Mr. Holloway," he said, exhaustion mixing with relief. "Rachel made it through surgery. She's alive." I closed my eyes for a brief moment and whispered the first prayer I had spoken since Catherine died. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket, opened the SUV door, and stepped into the warm Florida night. Rachel had survived. Connor had no idea that the only thing standing between him and complete destruction had just disappeared forever. The Sunset Harbor Club was exactly the kind of place Connor loved. Everything about it was designed to impress people who confused luxury with success. Marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Expensive sports cars lined the private entrance, while waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne toward guests who never bothered asking the price. Connor had always believed wealth was something to display. I had spent 40 years learning that real wealth was something you used quietly. The resort manager was already waiting near the entrance when our SUV stopped. Garrison had spoken to him before we arrived. His nervous expression told me he understood two things. First, I wasn't there to make a scene. Second, refusing to cooperate would become the most expensive decision of his career. Without asking questions, he handed Garrison a master access card to every private area of the property. "Mr. Davenport is still by the infinity pool," he whispered. "He hasn't left all evening." I thanked him with a nod and walked toward the ocean without another word. Long before Connor saw me, I saw him. He sat on a white lounge chair with his feet resting on a small table, laughing as another bottle of imported champagne was opened beside him. Emily leaned against his shoulder while absent-mindedly playing with Catherine's sapphire necklace around her neck. Every time the diamonds caught the light, I remembered fastening that necklace behind Rachel's neck on her wedding day. She had cried as she hugged me, promising she would treasure it for the rest of her life. Connor had stolen far more than jewelry. He had stolen memories that never belonged to him. Before I took another step, my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Jackson Memorial Hospital. I answered immediately. The surgeon's voice sounded exhausted but calm. "Mr. Holloway, I wanted you to hear this from me before anyone else. The operation was successful. We stabilized Rachel's spine. The swelling is under control, and she's awake for short periods. She has a long recovery ahead, but she's alive." For several seconds I couldn't speak. The pressure that had been crushing my chest since landing in Miami finally eased. Rachel was alive. Connor's plan, whatever it truly was, had failed. "Thank you, doctor," I said quietly. "One more thing," he continued. "We've restricted all visitors exactly as you requested. No one enters her room without your authorization. Keep it that way." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Garrison looked at me. "She's going to make it?" I nodded. "Yes." He smiled for the first time that night. Then Connor just lost the only chance he thought he had. I looked toward the pool, where Connor raised another champagne glass while Emily laughed beside him. He had no idea Rachel was alive. He had no idea every lie he had built his future upon had already begun collapsing. More importantly, he had no idea that every financial escape route had quietly disappeared during the past 2 hours. Victoria called next. "Phase 2 is complete," she said. "Every acquisition has settled. The mortgage transferred, the vehicle loan transferred, the credit lines transferred, the gambling notes transferred. His bank has already received notices accelerating repayment under the default clauses." "Has he seen any of it yet?" I asked. "Not yet. Most of the notifications are waiting for him to unlock his phone." I smiled faintly. "Good. Let him enjoy one more drink." Victoria hesitated before asking, "Marcus, after tonight there won't be any path back for him." I watched Connor lean over to kiss Emily, while Rachel lay in intensive care hundreds of miles away learning how to survive another day. "There wasn't one the moment he walked away from my daughter's hospital bed," I replied. Victoria didn't argue. She simply answered, "I'll stay available," before ending the call. I slipped the phone into my jacket and finally began walking across the pool deck. The sound of my shoes against the stone was almost completely drowned out by music and laughter. Connor still hadn't noticed me. Neither had Emily. They were too busy discussing where to spend the next week after Key West. Another island, another resort, another fantasy, funded with money that no longer existed. I stopped only a few feet behind Connor and waited. One of the waiters looked up, recognized the expression on my face, and quietly stepped backward without saying a word. Connor lifted his champagne glass again, completely unaware that the man standing behind him had already taken away everything he believed he owned. I looked once more at Catherine's necklace resting against Emily's neck, then shifted my eyes to Connor. "Enjoy this moment," I whispered softly enough that only I could hear it. "Because it's the last one you'll ever have." Then I spoke loud enough for him to turn around. "Good evening, Connor." Connor turned so quickly that champagne splashed across the front of his white linen shirt. For a brief second, pure fear crossed his face, before years of practiced deception took over. He forced a relieved smile and hurried toward me with his arms half open. "Dad," he said, pretending to be overwhelmed with emotion. "Thank God you're here. I was just about to fly back to Miami. How's Rachel? Please tell me she's okay." I didn't answer immediately. Incommensurably seated beside the pool, Emily, who remained comfortably seated beside the pool. Catherine's sapphire necklace still rested against her neck, sparkling beneath the resort lights, as though it had always belonged there. Connor noticed where I was looking and instinctively stepped sideways, trying to block my view. "Who's your friend?" I asked calmly. Connor laughed nervously. "Emily? She's just someone I met at the wellness retreat. We realized we were staying at the same resort, so we had dinner together." Emily frowned slightly, but said nothing. She clearly hadn't expected to become part of the conversation. "A wellness retreat?" I repeated. "Interesting. It sounds remarkably similar to a 5-star vacation." Connor swallowed hard. "Dad, I know how this looks." "No," I interrupted quietly. "You have absolutely no idea how this looks." I reached into my jacket and removed my phone. "Rachel survived." Relief should have appeared on his face. Instead, for the briefest fraction of a second, I saw disappointment, tiny, almost invisible. But after decades of negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, I had built an entire career reading the expressions people failed to control. Connor quickly corrected himself and forced a smile. "That's incredible. Thank God. I should head back immediately." "No," I said. "You're exactly where I want you." His smile disappeared. Around us, the music continued playing while other guests laughed, completely unaware that Connor's life had already begun collapsing. I unlocked my phone and turned the screen toward him. "Check your banking app." He looked confused but complied. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. He refreshed the screen once, then again. Every checking account showed a 0 available balance. Every credit line displayed "account frozen." Every debit card had been declined under accelerated collection procedures. What is this?" he whispered. "There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I replied. While you were drinking champagne, every institution you owed money to sold your debt. Connor stared at me in disbelief. To who? To me. His eyes widened. That's impossible. No, I said. It's expensive. There's a difference. I calmly opened another document on my phone. Your mortgage? Mine. Your Range Rover loan? Mine. Your credit card balances? Mine. The gambling debts you've been hiding from Rachel? Also mine. Connor's breathing became noticeably faster. You can't just buy someone's life. Actually, I answered, banks do it every day. Emily slowly stood from her chair. Connor, what is he talking about? Connor ignored her completely. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped his phone. I'll pay everything, he insisted. Just give me some time. I shook my head. Your contracts don't give you time. They contain acceleration clauses. Because you've already defaulted, the full balance is now due immediately. I paused, just long enough for the words to sink in. You owe me $5,874,000. He looked as though someone had punched him in the chest. I don't have that kind of money. I know. You'll destroy me. No, Connor. I stepped one pace closer. You destroyed yourself the day you decided my daughter was worth less than your next vacation. His phone suddenly vibrated over and over again. Email after email, text message after text message, mortgage default notices, credit card cancellations, vehicle repossession alerts, formal demands for immediate repayment. Every notification arrived within seconds of the others, until the screen became impossible to read. Connor desperately opened one after another, hoping one of them would be different. None were. Emily quietly glanced over his shoulder. Her expression changed from confusion to alarm. Connor, she whispered, you told me you owned the penthouse. He said nothing. You told me your company was about to go public. Still nothing. She looked at me instead. Is any of this true? Every word? I answered. The only thing he actually owns tonight is the debt he's spent years hiding. Emily slowly reached toward her neck, unclasped Catherine's sapphire necklace, and stared at it for several seconds before looking back at Connor. You said your wife gave you this. Connor tried to speak, but no words came out. Emily's face hardened with disgust. She dropped the necklace onto the table between us. You're a liar. Without another sentence, she picked up her handbag and walked away. Connor called after her twice. She never turned around. He watched her disappear through the resort lobby before lowering his head into his hands. In less than 5 minutes, he'd lost his money, his image, and the woman he thought would stay as long as the luxury lasted. I quietly picked up Catherine's necklace from the table and slipped it into my pocket. Then I looked back at Connor. Financially, I said, you're already finished. I let the silence hang between us before adding the words that made him slowly lift his head again. The only question left now is whether losing your money will be the worst thing that happens to you tonight. Connor stood frozen beside the pool, staring at the endless stream of default notices still flooding his phone. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Around us, the music continued playing. Guests laughed over expensive cocktails, and waves rolled gently against the private marina, as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Then Connor looked up. You planned this, he whispered. The moment you walked in here. No, I answered calmly. I planned this the moment I found my daughter lying alone in intensive care while you were drinking champagne. He tried to recover his confidence, forcing a weak laugh. Fine. You bought my debt. Congratulations. I'll declare bankruptcy. I'll rebuild. You can't destroy someone forever. I looked at him without changing expression. You're right. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Money isn't what destroys people forever. Before he could ask what I meant, Garrison walked across the pool deck, carrying a black evidence case. He placed it quietly on the table between us and opened it. Inside were high-resolution photographs of Rachel's Mercedes, taken only hours earlier inside a secure forensic garage in Miami. Connor's eyes immediately dropped to the images. The first showed the mangled front suspension. The second focused on the driver's side brake assembly. The third was an extreme close-up of the severed brake line. What is this? Connor asked, though his voice had already begun to shake. The official police report called it driver error, I replied. I wasn't satisfied. I slid another photograph toward him, so I hired my own forensic engineers. He stared at the picture without blinking. A specialist's report lay beneath it. Bright yellow markings highlighted a clean cut across the hydraulic brake line. There was no tearing, no impact damage, no corrosion, just one precise incision. "That's impossible," Connor whispered. "Brake lines don't just—" His voice stopped. He had almost corrected himself before realizing what he was about to admit. I leaned slightly closer. "No," I said quietly. "They don't." Garrison opened another folder. Our engineers also identified residue from a corrosion delay compound applied to the cut. Whoever sabotaged the brakes wanted them to fail after the vehicle had been driven long enough to make the crash appear accidental. Connor suddenly stepped backward. "You're insane," he snapped. "Someone could have done that at a repair shop. Anyone had access to the car." "Perhaps," I agreed. "That's why I never accuse anyone without evidence." I removed another document from the case and placed it beside the insurance policy Victoria had discovered earlier. "6 weeks before the crash, you purchased a $5 million life insurance policy on Rachel." I tapped the highlighted paragraph. $10 million if her death resulted from an accident. Connor stared at the paper, but said nothing. "Then you forged her signature to borrow $1.8 million against the penthouse." Another document landed on the table. "Then you lost nearly every dollar gambling." Another page followed. "And while she fought for her life, you abandoned the hospital, refused to authorize emergency surgery, and celebrated at a luxury resort with another woman." Connor's breathing became rapid. "None of that proves I touched the car." "You're right again," I said. "By itself, it doesn't." I nodded toward Garrison. He reached into the evidence case one final time and removed a tablet. With a single touch, security footage began playing. It wasn't from the highway. It wasn't from a traffic camera. It was Rachel's own cloud-connected dash cam, which automatically activated whenever the vehicle started. The video showed Rachel walking toward her SUV early that morning, carrying coffee in one hand and her work bag in the other. She unlocked the driver's door and placed her bag inside. Then, reflected clearly in the side mirror, another figure briefly appeared beside the front wheel. A man wearing a gray hoodie crouched near the brake assembly before standing and glancing toward the vehicle. His face was visible for barely 2 seconds. It was Connor. The color disappeared from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse. "No," he whispered. That's not." He couldn't finish the sentence because he knew exactly what he was looking at. I paused the video on the clearest frame. "Rachel never knew I had this camera installed," I said. "After several executives at one of my companies received threats years ago, I began adding cloud-based dash cams to every vehicle my family drove. The recordings upload automatically the moment the engine starts." Connor's knees gave way. He sank onto the edge of a lounge chair, staring at the frozen image of himself on the screen. Every excuse he'd prepared during the flight back to Miami. Every lie he planned to tell investigators. Every story about meditation retreats and emotional exhaustion disappeared in a single frame of video. Tears filled his eyes, though I couldn't tell whether they came from fear or self-pity. Finally, barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "She was going to leave me." I said nothing. He continued staring at the ground. "She found out about the mortgage, about Emily, about everything. She said she'd file for divorce the following week." He swallowed hard before admitting the words that sealed his own fate. "If she divorced me, I'd lose everything." I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "So you decided she should lose everything first." At that exact moment, flashing blue lights reflected across the surface of the infinity pool. Resort guests turned toward the entrance as 2 police cruisers rolled quietly through the front gate. Connor slowly lifted his head, watched the officers step out of their vehicles, and finally understood that losing his fortune had only been the beginning. The music stopped almost the moment the first police cruiser entered the resort. Conversations faded into uneasy whispers as guests turned toward the flashing blue lights, reflecting across the infinity pool. Connor remained seated exactly where he was, his hands hanging helplessly between his knees, while the frozen dashcam image of himself crouching beside Rachel's Mercedes still glowed on the tablet lying across the table. Two detectives walked calmly toward us, followed by uniformed officers who immediately secured the surrounding area without creating unnecessary drama. The lead detective introduced himself as Detective Alvarez from the Miami-Dade Major Crimes Unit before shaking my hand briefly. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "our department received the forensic report from your engineering team less than an hour ago. We independently confirmed the findings with state investigators before coming here." He then looked directly at Connor. "Mr. Davenport, we've also reviewed the financial records, the insurance policy, the mortgage documents, and the digital evidence recovered from your wife's vehicle." Connor slowly stood, looking from one officer to another, as though searching for an escape that no longer existed. "I want a lawyer," he muttered. Detective Alvarez nodded politely. "You'll have one." Connor took one unsteady step backward. "You don't understand. This wasn't supposed to." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. The detective calmly continued reading his constitutional rights, while another officer produced a pair of handcuffs. Around us, dozens of resort guests had gathered silently. Some were recording with their phones. Others simply watched in disbelief as the well-dressed businessman who had spent the evening ordering expensive champagne suddenly became the center of a homicide investigation. Emily slowly walked back onto the pool deck after realizing police had arrived. Her eyes moved from the officers to Connor, then finally to me. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. Detective Alvarez instead held up a photograph showing the severed brake line. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. "He said his wife crashed because she was texting," she whispered. "He told me it was a terrible accident." Connor closed his eyes. He couldn't even look at her anymore. Emily took several slow steps backward as tears filled her eyes. "You tried to kill her?" she asked, almost unable to say the words aloud. Connor never answered. His silence was answer enough. Emily looked completely shattered. "I thought you were leaving a bad marriage," she whispered. "I never knew." She couldn't finish the sentence. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the hotel lobby, leaving Connor completely alone for the first time since the investigation had begun. An officer secured the handcuffs around Connor's wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed across the suddenly silent resort. Connor looked toward me one last time. Gone was the arrogant husband who had abandoned my daughter beside an operating table. Gone was the man who believed money could erase consequences. Standing before me now was simply a frightened criminal watching every lie collapse at once. "Marcus," he said quietly, "please." I looked at him without anger, without satisfaction, only disappointment. "Rachel loved you," I replied. "She trusted you with her future. That was worth more than every dollar you ever tried to steal." Connor lowered his head. He had no defense left. As detectives escorted him toward the waiting cruiser, every employee standing near the entrance instinctively stepped aside. No one applauded. No one mocked him. Sometimes, silence carries far more weight than humiliation ever could. Once the police vehicles disappeared through the resort gates, Garrison handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside rested Catherine's sapphire necklace, polished clean after Emily had surrendered it earlier that evening. I held it carefully in both hands, remembering the day I had clasped it around my wife's neck for our 20th anniversary, and the day Rachel had promised to protect it forever. "Let's take it home," I said softly. Early the next morning, our plane landed back in Miami. I drove directly from the airport to Jackson Memorial Hospital without stopping anywhere else. The same nurse who had greeted me the previous day smiled as I entered the intensive care unit. "She's asking for you," she whispered. My heart began racing. I quietly stepped inside Rachel's room. The machines were still there, but this time her eyes were open. She looked weak, exhausted, and frightened, yet unmistakably alive. When she saw me standing in the doorway, tears immediately filled her eyes. "Dad," she whispered. I walked to her bedside, took her hand gently, and placed Catherine's sapphire necklace into her palm. Rachel stared at it for several long seconds before beginning to cry. "I thought it was gone," she whispered. I gently closed her fingers around it. No, I said. The only thing that's gone is the man who never deserved either you or your mother's memory. Rachel squeezed my hand as tears rolled silently down her face. Outside the hospital room, the morning sun finally began rising over Miami. Inside, for the first time since the nightmare had begun, hope quietly returned with it. Rachel slept for most of the next 2 days. The surgeons explained that keeping her comfortable was just as important as repairing the damage to her spine. Every time she woke, she became a little stronger, a little more aware, and a little more willing to talk about what had happened before the crash. I never pushed her. Trauma has its own timetable, and forcing memories rarely brings healing. Instead, I sat beside her bed, read aloud from the novel her mother used to love, and waited until she was ready. On the third afternoon, Rachel asked the nurse to leave us alone. She stared quietly through the hospital window for several moments before speaking. Dad, I need to tell you something. I pulled my chair closer but said nothing. Connor wasn't surprised when I confronted him about the money. Her voice was still weak, but every word carried the weight of months of silent suffering. I found the mortgage documents almost 3 weeks before the accident. At first I thought someone had stolen my identity. Then I recognized my own signature, except it wasn't mine. Tears slowly filled her eyes. When I confronted him, he admitted he'd taken the loan. He promised he'd fix everything if I gave him a little more time. I quietly reached for her hand. Did you believe him? Rachel slowly shook her head. Not anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment before continuing. A few days later, I found messages between him and another woman. She swallowed hard. Emily. The name hung silently between us. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He told me I cared too much about honesty, that successful people did whatever they had to do. I could almost hear Connor saying those words. Rachel forced a sad smile. Do you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the affair. It wasn't the money. She looked directly at me. It was realizing I'd married someone who had started seeing kindness as weakness. She took a slow breath. The night before the accident, I met with my attorney. My heart tightened. I signed divorce papers. Suddenly every piece fit together. Connor's panic, the insurance policy, the forged loan, the mounting debts. Rachel had unknowingly become the final obstacle, standing between him and financial ruin. I was going to file the paperwork Monday morning, she whispered. I never made it. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with all the moments that could never be changed. Finally, Rachel reached toward the drawer beside her bed and removed a sealed envelope the nurse had been keeping for her personal belongings. There's something else, she said. The doctors confirmed it yesterday. She handed me a small ultrasound photograph. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then my eyes focused on the handwritten note across the top. 8 weeks. I looked back at Rachel, unable to speak. She nodded slowly as tears rolled down her cheeks. I found out I was pregnant the morning of the accident. My entire body went still. Connor hadn't only tried to eliminate his wife for money. If Rachel had died that morning, he would also have killed the child he never even knew existed. Rachel gently wiped away a tear. He kept asking why I seemed distracted that weekend. A heartbreaking smile crossed her face. I was trying to decide how to tell him he was going to be a father. The room became painfully quiet. I carefully held the ultrasound photo between my hands, thinking about how close I had come to losing both my daughter and the grandchild I never knew existed. Rachel finally broke the silence. Promise me something, anything. Don't ever tell Connor about the baby. I looked at her in surprise. She continued before I could answer. He gave up the right to be this child's father the moment he chose greed over our lives. I don't want my son or daughter growing up knowing the man who should have protected us tried to profit from our deaths. I nodded slowly. That decision will always be yours. Later that evening, Victoria entered the room carrying a thick folder. The state attorney's office has finalized the indictment, she said. Attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, mortgage fraud, forgery, and multiple financial crimes. She placed the folder gently on the bedside table. The arraignment is scheduled for next month. Rachel looked down at the ultrasound photograph, still resting in her lap before quietly slipping it back into the envelope. Then she looked at me with a strength I hadn't seen since before the accident. "I'm ready," she said. "This time, I'm not walking into that courtroom as Connor's wife." She paused, took a slow breath, and finished with calm certainty. "I'm walking in as the woman who survived him." 6 months later, every seat inside the Miami Federal Courthouse was filled before the trial even began. Reporters crowded the hallway, while prosecutors carried years of financial records, forensic reports, insurance documents, and digital evidence into the courtroom. By then, Connor's carefully constructed life had already collapsed. Every fraudulent transaction had been traced. Rachel's forged signature had been verified by independent handwriting experts. Engineers confirmed the brake line on her Mercedes had been deliberately cut with a precision tool, while digital forensic specialists authenticated the dashcam footage beyond any reasonable challenge. Connor's defense attorneys tried to argue financial desperation, poor judgment, and emotional instability. The prosecutor quietly stood and pointed toward the evidence displayed on the courtroom screen. "Desperate people make mistakes," she said. "The defendant made plans. He forged documents. He purchased a $10 million accidental death policy. He sabotaged his wife's vehicle. He abandoned her while surgeons fought to save her life. Then he celebrated at a luxury resort believing she would never wake up. That isn't desperation. That's premeditation." The courtroom remained silent as the judge reviewed the final sentencing order. After several long moments, he looked directly at Connor. "Mr. Davenport, the evidence proves you betrayed not only your marriage but every legal and moral obligation you accepted when you vowed to protect your wife. This court finds you guilty on all major counts." He paused before delivering the final sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to 45 years in federal prison." Connor slowly turned toward Rachel one last time as deputies stepped beside him. She sat quietly next to me, one hand resting gently across her stomach beneath a loose blue dress. His eyes lingered there for several seconds. Confusion slowly became realization, then disbelief. "Rachel," he whispered. "Are you?" His voice broke before he could finish. She didn't answer. She simply looked at him with complete calm. Connor's eyes filled with panic. "My baby?" he asked desperately. For the first time since the trial began, I stood. I looked directly at him before speaking quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "No, Connor. You gave up the right to call that child yours the moment you chose money over both their lives." Connor collapsed emotionally. "Please," he cried as deputies pulled him toward the courtroom exit. "Please don't do this." Rachel never looked away, but she never answered him either. The heavy steel door closed behind Connor, and with it disappeared every opportunity he would ever have to know the child he had almost murdered before taking his first breath. Several months later, the Brickell penthouse was sold under court supervision. After every victim had been compensated through the court's restitution process, I purchased the property back with my own money. People assumed I intended to move into it. Instead, construction crews spent 6 months transforming the luxury residence into the Catherine Holloway Hope Center, providing free legal assistance, emergency housing referrals, financial counseling, and recovery programs for victims of domestic financial abuse and coercive control. Above the entrance, where Connor's family name had once appeared in polished steel, a new inscription welcomed every visitor. Catherine Holloway Hope Center, where no one faces betrayal alone. Rachel attended the opening ceremony, walking without assistance, after nearly a year of rehabilitation. Watching her cross the stage under her own strength brought louder applause than any business success I had ever experienced. 3 months later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Thomas after my father, the man who had taught me that integrity was worth more than any fortune. As I held my grandson for the first time, I realized life had quietly replaced everything greed had tried to steal. On the first anniversary of Catherine's passing, Rachel, little Thomas, and I visited the Hope Center before driving to the cemetery. Inside the entrance hall hung a large photograph of Catherine smiling exactly as I remembered her. Thomas, now beginning to walk, wandered toward the picture and placed his tiny hand against the frame. Rachel smiled through tears. "Mom would have spoiled him," she whispered. I gently lifted Thomas into my arms and looked at Catherine's photograph one final time. You were right, I said softly. Love was never the inheritance that needed protecting. Character was. As we walked out into the afternoon sunlight, families were already arriving at the Hope Center seeking the help they never thought existed. Behind us, Catherine's name had become a place where broken lives could begin again. Ahead of us, Thomas laughed in Rachel's arms, without ever knowing how close he had come to never taking his first breath. In the end, Connor believed $10 million would buy him a better future. He was wrong. The only future his greed ever purchased was a prison cell, while the family he tried to destroy went on to build a legacy that would outlive him by generations.